Jabu Jabu's belly, like the other child dungeons, is not a dungeon in the traditional sense, but rather an enormous dying or dead organism. This feature is what makes the child dungeons stand apart from the adult ones, because of how distinct their organic structures are from one another. The rooms of the Great Deku Tree are composed of its rotting wooden insides, Dodongo's cavern is supported by molten rock and the fossilized remains of a titan, and Jabu Jabu's belly is the massive internals of a dying whale, or fish. I think this element is something the later dungeons suffer from to a degree, where they all feel somewhat the same due to them all being essentially structures made from steel bars and crumbling bricks. Along with their appearance, each of the three child dungeons have their own distinct atmosphere and unique tone. The Great Deku Tree is calming and safe, Dodongo's cavern is gloomy and still, and Jabu Jabu's belly is gross and oppressive. More so than the previous two dungeons, Jabu Jabu's belly is a labyrinth of confusing paths and rooms, which are absolutely stuffed with difficult enemies and challenging puzzles. Even just ignoring the gameplay side of things, Jabu Jabu is still the most oppressive of the three. Encroaching on every room are walls of red, pulsating, veiny flesh, and the groans of the whale's contracting organs as it writhes in pain from its sickness. The belly of the beast is not a very inviting place. It's little wonder that this dungeon is not viewed as favorably as many of the others. From my perspective, it's clear that this dungeon is generally considered to be either frustrating, tedious, a chore to get through, or just not that much fun. While I don't agree with many of these opinions, there is a good cause for them. Whereas most dungeons are the parts of the game that the player looks forward to playing the most, I believe Jabu Jabu's belly to be much the opposite. I can't help but think that the longer one spends within the claustrophobic and nauseating stomach of the beast, the stronger the desire to return to the open fields and blue skies might become for them. This is only exaggerated by the fact that Jabu Jabu is a significant step up in difficulty from its predecessors. In fact, the greatest challenge of Jabu Jabu's belly may simply be finding the correct route to go. While the previous dungeons only gave illusions of depth, this time it is real. The very first time Link encounters Ruto, there are at least a dozen vortexes that can be jumped into, and even though they all lead to the same room below, the spot they put you in is significant. Previously, the path ahead was either a straight shot towards the destination, or they had a very short detour that the player had to venture down in order to proceed down the main route. While to some degree Jabu Jabu is still a linear progression from start to finish, there's an unmistakable push from the level designers to force Link to backtrack, and every time Link backtracks, the possibility that he might get confused or lost increases. For example, Link has to travel through the chamber with the vortexes more than several times, and with the number of directions to go from there, losing track of the objective can be extremely easy. The entirety of the first half of the dungeon follows a set pattern, where the player is presented with two routes, with one being obstructed or locked. The player follows the open route which leads directly back to where they began, with the obstructed path now being available to enter. This pattern should not be new. It occurred twice in the Great Deku Tree, several times in Dodongo's cavern, and will be expounded upon later and made more complicated in the adult dungeons. It's obvious that the dungeon designers discovered this formula and built every dungeon from the ground up off of it. And I don't particularly mind the repetition of this loop pattern, as I'll call it. It's an effective way of keeping the dungeons from becoming unintelligible mazes with no coherent flow or leading direction behind them. Seriously, take a look at some of the mods for this game. They're absolutely broken. It seems that in an effort to make a dungeon challenging, most fans just end up creating these monstrosities of endless paths and corridors with a billion dead ends. The dungeon designers were aware that in order to make these levels fun while still challenging, there had to be a level of predictability and a logical system to how the player moved forward. And the loop system is a good way of doing both. Along the confusing route towards the finish are a myriad of different puzzles. Most of them are fairly simple, consisting of Link activating a switch in some way. The method by which Link activates these switches is mostly done through the use of the boomerang, which is acquired at around the halfway point. Once the player figures out that the boomerang is the key to solving every problem and beating every enemy, the fun of relying on alternative ways of getting things done does become lost in a way. Take for example that before acquiring the boomerang, Link could either kill the jellyfish enemies by flashing them with Deku Nuts and then slashing them up, or pick up Ruto and toss her into them. Same goes for the switches. To activate the ceiling switches, Link had to use a projectile to hit them. The fun in that is that there were a surprising amount of projectiles that could work. Ruto, Deku Seeds, even bombs could all be tossed to open a locked door. The problem is, after acquiring the boomerang, the player is no longer forced to think of creative solutions to beat the challenges ahead of them. It just becomes a matter of seeing where Link should stand if he is to reach the object he wants to hit with his boomerang. I can't help but wonder if the formula of gaining a new item in every dungeon is somewhat detrimental to the game in some way. While it certainly does give the player a sense of growth and power, and while that is satisfying, it does make the dungeons predictable to a certain degree. I suppose it's just a matter of how subtle or challenging the puzzles are, and I shouldn't expect anything too difficult from a child's dungeon. I should also mention that the switches on the ceiling are kind of problematic as well, as after a good while of shooting them with the slingshot, it's inevitable that you'll run out of Deku Seeds, and at that point you're just kind of screwed. There are almost no sources for them inside the dungeon, and they're also nowhere to be found in Zora's domain, which makes finding seeds if you happen to run out an absolute headache. Recently, I did learn of the cellar that hides beneath the floating platform in the second vertical room, but I don't think that's enough. The player should not have to backtrack simply to open a door. I feel that's a bit unnecessary. But I can't go on talking about the puzzles without mentioning this level's central gimmick, that being in the form of the Zora Princess. The entire first section of this dungeon is essentially an extended escort mission, which for those who aren't familiar, an escort mission is a kind of quest in video games, where the player is tasked to safely escort a non-playable character to their destination. They have a reputation for being some of the most frustrating levels within games all across the board. This is because the pace of the typical escort mission is determined by the speed of the computer player, and the fact that the intelligence of their AI is often frustratingly low. Ocarina of Time negates both of these issues by forcing the player to carry Ruto around, instead of having Ruto follow the player. This prevents the possible glitch that could occur where the computer player gets stuck on the environment's geometry as it moves. It may seem that being forced to carry Ruto around for half a dungeon would become tedious, and to a certain extent it does. Especially when putting into consideration how many enemies there are in every area that require the player to put Ruto down before they fight. I admit that picking her up and down over and over again does become repetitive. I can only imagine that those first-time players who really don't know their way around would quickly become frustrated with having to stop and start just because of Ruto. As I said earlier, she can be thrown as a weapon to kill enemies, but also as a tool to open doors. This keeps her from being a totally detrimental aspect of the dungeon, as her inclusion does offer the player a variety of different options as to how to play. It should be mentioned that the escorting portion of the dungeon, while it does last for a while, does not last throughout the entirety of the runtime. She gets separated from Link at around the mid-boss fight, and the entire last portion of the dungeon is basically a straight shot to the finish, just as the previous dungeons were. I suppose I don't really mind the escort aspect of this dungeon, and I appreciate the developers for doing something different to make Jabu Jabu somewhat more unique than what the player has already experienced up until this point. My solution to alleviate the tediousness of the escort aspect would be to simply make it shorter, as in have Ruto get separated from Link sooner than what she does. From a narrative perspective, her getting captured has an intriguing effect, which from my experience has always created a sense of gravity that the previous dungeons did not possess. And it also provides me with a subtle feeling of urgency. Because of this, I'd say the integration of the story within the dungeon is successful, which is quite strange considering how sparse it is within this game. For example, similar story beats are used in the Spirit Temple, where the capture of the Gerudo Chief is used to give the player a sense of purpose and the gameplay some weight behind it. It also occurs in the Fire Temple with the freeing of the Goron prisoners, but beyond that, it's not used much elsewhere. I believe the integration of the story into the dungeons themselves is really effective, and I wish it was used more often, as opposed to just providing a story before entering the dungeon and then placing it on pause until it's over. But I can't keep talking about the items and the puzzles and the abundance of monsters without addressing the enemies themselves. As you might expect, the enemies are all water themed and are slightly more difficult than the enemies of the past. But this doesn't mean they don't operate much the same way. Most of the enemies have portions where they are invincible, but then expose themselves right before an attack. This fighting formula is consistent throughout the entire game and works pretty well here. However, not all of the enemies behave in this fashion. I like the inclusion of the bubbles, as they can be killed whenever, don't really attack, but still can be dangerous due to the fact that there's so many of them, and you're bound to run into them at least a few times. Along with those mindless monsters, there are many enemies that are extremely ruthless. The electric worm things, for example, are some of the most troublesome enemies in the whole game, as striking them with anything other than Ruto or the boomerang is ineffective or deals damage to the player instead. I'm kind of mixed on these types because they're extremely frustrating to come across early on in the dungeon before you get the boomerang, but I do understand that it's through being able to one-shot these once very bothersome monsters that makes acquiring the boomerang as satisfying as it is. While speaking of enemies, it's impossible to overlook the boss battles. And once again, unlike the previous levels, Jabu Jabu's Belly has two, a mid-boss fight and of course the final boss fight, both of which are very memorable and fun. The mid-boss is essentially an oversized Octorok that does nothing but run around in a circular course, changing direction every so often. It's a lot like King Dodongo, except this time there's no safe places to escape the incoming monster from. The only option Link has is to use the boomerang to freeze and reverse the direction of the squid, and then immediately freeze it again to expose the weak spot to Link's sword. While this may sound easy, and in reality it is, the lack of any safe zones to escape getting ran over means that any new players will inevitably get crushed a few times before they figure out perhaps just how to freeze it. In that respect, this boss fight is an example of a rare case where the game punishes the player the longer they take to solve a riddle. The more time it takes you to figure out the correct winning strategy, the more hearts you lose and the closer to losing you become. With most other bosses, you basically have all the time in the world to figure out how to beat them, because you always have the opportunity to avoid their attacks. I kinda wish this style of enemy was present more often within the Zelda franchise. I mean, this isn't a franchise that's really known to be difficult combat-wise, and to be honest, it's probably best that way, but I still wouldn't mind seeing a further push in that direction from time to time, especially considering that most of the bosses in the games after this are fairly easy. And of course, I can't go on without talking about Baronade, the spectacular final boss. While the previous bosses were just bigger versions of average enemies, Baronade is all its own thing. King Dodongo was just a bigger Dodongo, no big deal. But Baronade is just an absolute monster. It's this massive parasitic abomination covered in armored jellyfish that detach and spin around in an impenetrable wall. On its head are a bunch of antennae that shoot electricity bolts. It's just wild. It's such a brilliant design and fight overall. I like how there's multiple stages to it, rather than just a repeat of the same gimmick over and over again, like King Dodongo. Instead of just chucking your boomerang at it like 3 times or something, you gotta disable the connection between the parasite and the whale. And then while the monster is disabled, you have to off all the jellyfish. And then once all the jellyfish are gone, the soft, fleshy stomach of the beast is exposed to slash up. It's so fun. This is the kind of boss fight I wish most were like. It's not incredibly difficult by any means, but it evolves and gets crazier and more wild as it goes on. The fight has such a perfect progression that even though I find it simple to beat now, it's still intense to play. From a design standpoint, Baronade is an absolute masterpiece. It has a weak spot, but it's not just some generic eyeball slapped onto some monster's head. Exposing its weakness is a multi-step process. Usually, the weakest part of a boss fight is when you have to kill all the pathetic minion enemies. But here it's absolutely fine because they're a part of its body and are essentially disposable weapons. I also love the grand finish with the green blood spewing everywhere after Baronade's body bubbles up and pops in the most disgusting fanfare of gross cinematics. It's just great. End of story. So I suppose that's all there is to really say about the depth of the gameplay. I could go deeper as I have in the past, but honestly, no one really wants to hear about how each specific riddle is solved or descriptions of every single room. Instead, I want to spend the last part of this video by just giving my own personal opinions on Jabu Jabu's Belly in a highly disorganized fashion. Okay, so anyway, where does Jabu Jabu go after the 7 years? Does he die? You'd think even after 7 years that there'd be a carcass someplace, like somewhere down in the water? Oh well, maybe he just swam away, I don't know. Anyway, for real this time, Jabu Jabu has never been the kind of dungeon I've looked forward to playing. As much as I love the bold and aggressive creative decisions here, like putting a dungeon inside of a whale, I can't help but find the fleshy, living walls and incessant groans of pain and the unsettling soundtrack to culminate in an experience that I find fairly unenjoyable. Which is paradoxical because I really enjoy the challenges and story in this level. I mean, I don't know. As for the soundtrack itself, I feel it really works for the atmosphere, but it just isn't really something I would ever listen to outside of the game, unlike a few of the other ambient tracks such as the Deku Tree and Forest Temple tracks, which are absolute bops. I believe it services the experience well enough. My opinions on the escort portion are pretty much the same. It's fine. I think without it, the dungeon would certainly be missing something crucial, as the part where Ruto gets taken is actually very effective for giving the dungeon a real sense of gravity. I also don't mind the map layout scheme, as most of it is distinct in its appearance through unique color and construction, which makes navigating through it doable. Honestly, my least favorite part of this dungeon is that it just feels claustrophobic, which is kinda what the developers went for, so not really a bad thing, I guess. That's more on me. It just seems like most of the dungeons in this game have left some sort of impact in my memory, as the Deku Tree has, for example. But with Jabu Jabu's belly, it's just a part of the game, and while I do have a great deal of nostalgia while playing it, it doesn't elicit any real strong emotions of any kind. But I suppose it really doesn't have to in order to still be well made. I'm not going to rank the dungeons yet. I want to save that for once I'm done with every dungeon in this game. But I can say with certainty that Jabu Jabu's belly is a lot better than Dodongo's Cavern, and is a masterpiece of game design.